Greetings to our siblings at the Door County Unitarian Universalist Fellowship from me, Jim Honig, and from your fellow people of faith, the people that I serve as pastor at Shepherd of the Bay Lutheran Church. I was supposed to have been with you this past Sunday, March 22nd, as your guest speaker. Like all of us, suspended our in-person services because of the pandemic. Sarah called last week and suggested that I record my message so that you could upload it to your website, so here I am. Let me say a few words of introduction first about me. I'm a product of rural America, having grown up in a couple of small towns in western Nebraska. I've spent most of my ministry in suburban and urban areas in the Midwest and in Florida. I've been a Lutheran pastor for 33 years, serving congregations in Missouri, Florida, Illinois, and now here in Door County. I'm married to Cheryl, father to Chris and Tim, father-in-law to Liz and Stacy, and grandfather to Hannah and Elijah. I'm coming to you today as a Christian pastor, someone who speaks out of the tradition of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures with a commitment to them and a theology which springs from that deep and rich well. I also come to you as a pastor who has been involved for almost 20 years now in broad-based community organizing. That has been very formative for my pastoral ministry. I'm also coming to you today in a time of great disruption. We find our personal lives disrupted, of course, by social isolation, which is difficult for us. We humans are social creatures. We've seen around the world the social disruption that this pandemic has caused to our medical systems, and we're beginning to see that right now in our own country. We've seen the reaction of the stock market and the massive shutdowns of businesses around the country and right here in Door County. And so we know that there will be economic disruption, the extent, of course, which we don't yet know. And that's one of the things that's hard about the moment we're in right now. There's so much uncertainty about the future and about how all of this will play out. The pandemic has uncovered a number of failures on the part of our current administration in particular, but our federal government more generally. It's frustrating, alarming, disconcerting to be sure. And while the consequences of this particular failure are more dire, probably far more reaching and likely more fatal, literally, it falls into a larger category of societal problems that have gone on for decades, regardless of which party happens to be in power. Environmental degradation, climate change, systemic racism, chronic poverty and hunger and homelessness, the appalling lack of dignified housing, predatory banking systems, corporate greed, the vast, obscene income inequality gap between the rich and the poor, a gap which continues to grow. When we look at the huge problems facing our country, indeed facing the global community, it can seem discouraging and, well, downright depressing. When I was a teen and just getting interested in politics, I remember the great statesman Tip O'Neill. His famous dictum was, "All politics is local." I think that's true. And as a corollary, I would suggest that all social justice work is local. As I mentioned earlier, for 15 years now, I've been involved in local congregation-based, broad-based community organizing. Learning the arts and practices of organizing became a game changer for me in my ministry, and it's allowed me a degree of effectiveness in social justice action that I had never experienced before. And one of the lessons that it has taught me is that while I might be powerless to address some of those huge problems at the societal level, problems that are endemic to our society, I can work at the local level to amass power to address some of the issues that challenge our families. In organizing, we don't talk so much about problems, especially the big societal problems, but we talk about issues. Problems are big and I can't solve them. In fact, you and I working together are pretty powerless to solve those huge societal problems. But if we can break those problems down into issues that we can address at the local level, then collectively we can make some progress. So I want to give you a couple of examples. In the last recession, now over 10 years ago, we began to ask what was on people's minds, and over people would tell us that they needed jobs, good, steady, dignified jobs that would allow them to care for their families, pay off debt, and maybe buy a home. And especially the boomers were saying that their Kids were graduating from high school and college and moving back home because they couldn't find decent jobs. The lack of good middle-class jobs is a pretty big problem, one that is endemic to our whole society, and one which I think I'm pretty powerless to solve on a national level. But a group of our leaders started looking into it. And at the local level, what they discovered was that several local manufacturing companies had good-paying entry-level jobs they couldn't fill. There was some training required, not a college degree, but training. And we already knew that there were young men and women eager to take these kind of jobs. There was an impasse between the young people that were ready to get into the workforce and the jobs that were available in the manufacturing community. We also discovered that in the western suburbs of Chicago, there had been a training center that had been built specifically for the purpose of training young folks for these kinds of jobs, but that it was virtually standing empty because the high schools were not allowing their students to get to those training centers. I don't have time to tell you all the maddening and also exhilarating parts of this story, but the short version is that we were able to connect the people, the training center, and the manufacturing companies to get folks into these jobs. So there's an example of a huge societal problem that we were able to break down into a local issue that we could make a big difference in our community. Right here in Door County, a small group has been working to form an organization designed to make homeownership a possibility for the working families in our community. And while the work has been admittedly slow, it is hopeful. And the Door County Housing Partnership is committed to bringing to the market homes that will remain accessible in perpetuity to our working families. Again, a large societal problem that we've broken down into an issue and are addressing right here in our local community. As a side note, I find it interesting so that some of our notable historians understand the power of working at the local level. In a recent book, Escape from Rome, Walter Scheidel, who is a Stanford historian, writes that the fall of the Roman Empire actually sparked an explosion of creativity at the local level that addressed some of the problems left in the wake of the erosion of the larger empire. The removal of centralized control opened the way to a sustained era of creativity at the duchy by duchy and monastery by monastery level, which in turn led to broad cultural advancement and eventual prosperity. The dawn of the university, private business organizations, the idea of personal rights and freedoms, on these and other fronts were what had been Roman territories now were able to move forward politically and culturally as the centralized control of the empire disappeared. Now, what motivates us to address these local challenges is that we have a vision for what the world should be. As I've already stated, we've got huge challenges in this country and indeed in the world. The world is not the way we want it to be. We have no illusions about the challenges that are before us. In order not to lose hope and to be empowered to take action, we need to hold these two things in tension. The world as we want it to be, the world as it should be, and the world as it really is. We are both visionaries and realists. We cling to a vision of a world in which everyone has a decent place to live, food on the table, a dignified job, the ability to save for the future, an environment that is healthy and has a symbiotic relationship with the human family, a world where more money is spent on human development than on weapons development. We cling to that vision even as we are realistic about the challenges we face. In the reading that Mark read a little while ago, there's something of that in what the prophet Isaiah was up to when he was returning to Jerusalem with the Jewish exiles. The Jewish exiles had come back to Jerusalem believing that the great kingdom of David would be restored, the temple would be rebuilt, and God's reign reestablished once and for all on Mount Zion. Yet that's not how things played out. Instead, they came back and found a city in ruins and the rebuilding of the temple and the city to be costly and painful and dangerous. The task of the prophet was to keep hope alive. Now, there were three kinds of hope in the Old Testament following the exile. The first was a messianic hope. It was all about the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. The king would be put back on the throne and all would be right with the world. This kind of hope was narrowly political. If we just get the right person in office, elect the right leader, everything will work out the way it's supposed to, except that it usually doesn't. The second kind of hope was apocalyptic. The world had gone terribly wrong and was so utterly beyond redemption that only a whole-scale destruction of the world as it is and a new order established by God could provide any hope for the future. Some of you might remember the wildly popular apocalyptic series that was called the Left Behind series. It embodied that kind of hope. A new day is coming, but only after everything we know has been destroyed. There's not much for us to do except to sit back and wait for it. It's a view that gives up on this world and hopes for something better in the next. The third kind of hope is the kind of hope we find in Isaiah. It's neither narrowly political, nor is it pie in the sky by and by. It doesn't pin its hope on a single political figure or even a political party or movement. Instead, it paints a picture of the world as it should be, in concrete and specific terms. It's a vision that's grounded in the real world that we all live in. It's a vision that announces an invitation for Isaiah and for all of those around him, other like-minded people, to be at work in the world, joining hearts and hands in whatever ways they can to create the new heaven and the new earth that we all long for. Listen again to these words that were written 2,500 years ago, and yet they sound as contemporary as this morning's newspaper. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. For they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like an ox. Now, no one could argue that these words are a description of the world we live in. We still live in a world where children die in infancy and the elder languish in neglect, a situation made more real and more frightening as we are smack dab in the middle of this pandemic, and it looks to have a dramatic impact on our people. We live in a world where the poor are exploited for their labor and safe and decent housing for everyone seems like a distant dream. And yet we hold in our hearts and in our minds a vision for what the world should be. Rebecca Solnit is one of those authors that for me holds in dramatic and wonderful fashion that tension between the stark reality of the world as it is and a vision of the world as it should be. Her 2016 book, Hope in the Dark, is primarily about addressing the environmental crisis. I think it's also useful for the larger social justice challenges that we face. She encourages us to live in hope. Together we can make a difference, especially as we face squarely the issues in our own communities, the issues that are challenges for our families. And so this is the time for you to find your place in this work if you haven't already. There's a role for everyone and everyone has to do their part. Solnit writes, "Hope locates itself in the premises that we don't know what will happen, and that in the spaciousness of uncertainty is room for us to act." That sounds wonderfully similar to the words that an ancient New Testament writer penned. Hope is the conviction of things not yet seen. And so here's to taking action to bring about the world for which we hope. Thank you, and blessings to you.